So, hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Book Cafe podcast. In today's episode, we will be talking about this book behind me right here entitled Drift by Shehzar Doja. And I bought this book about 6 years back. I went through a reread just before the start of this interview, and I'm really thrilled to have the author himself with us to talk about the book. So, Shehzar, first of all, do tell us a little bit about yourself and your background for our viewers and listeners who might be discovering you for the very first time. We'd love to get to know you a little bit before we dive into the book. So, your background, where you were born, where you were brought up, what you do for a living. In fact, anything at all that you'd like to share with us.
God, that's, that's the thing, you live a long time and you don't know where to start. Yes, I was born in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And I grew up in Dhaka, went to school there until I was about 16, 17, where I went to school in South India. And then I sort of moved around a little bit here and there. And then I moved to Luxembourg in 2014, I believe it was, and then from there I came to Glasgow to do my master's and to do a PhD, which is what I'm currently doing at the University of Glasgow, and I'm basically here at the moment. Yeah, that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, it seems like you've had quite the itinerant life, if I may say so. So you've been around a lot all over the world. So now you're in Glasgow. By any chance, your
Drifting from one place to another.
drifting from one place to another. I think that's a really nice way of putting it. So Shehzar, I do have to make a confession here. So obviously, I actually do know your family pretty well. Maybe we haven't had an opportunity to talk as much, but I know that your family was in Chittagong at one point, if I'm not mistaken. Did you also spend a lot of your formative years in Chittagong by any chance?
I did, and for the very early part of my years, was actually brought up in Chittagong, and then I had a cousin who lived there for a long period of time. So every winter and most summers, I used to constantly just go back to Chittagong and sort of spend those, like month vacations that we got off from school over there. So yeah, I have very, very, very fond memories of Chittagong and just the places around there.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. And so for our viewers and listeners who may not know, Chittagong is obviously the port city in Bangladesh, and we always make it a point on the show to try and highlight as many Chittagonians as possible. So even though you were born in Dhaka, I'm pretty sure that
It's an
a huge
honorary
part of
title,
you,
I hope.
yeah, honorary title, but yeah, definitely, having spent your formative years in Chittagong, so we will definitely consider you as one of our own. So yeah. So thank you for that. So, Shezar, tell us a little bit more about your formative years. Obviously you write poetry. So would you say that you actually come from a family that is very literary oriented? How would you describe yourself?
I would describe it as a family that is embracing of all sorts of artistic expressions. I think within our family we have a lot of musicians and we have a lot of we have actors, we have musicians, we have my grandmother. She is a poet. My grandfather, who recently passed away, he was very much deep into philosophy sort of sort of like I think it's a cultivation of these varying artistic expressions and sort of my formative years sort of being allowed to find my own way, like through poetry and through, I found that as my to be my voice. And I think, and but sort of this interweaving or mingling of these different variation artistic outlets allowed me to sort of infuse my own work with everything else that was sort of around me growing up.
Absolutely. So I think that that's very interesting to hear, Shezar, that because your family was very artistically inclined, so obviously that makes it a very conducive environment to write poetry, to actually have an affinity for the arts, etc. So would you say that your family was, and their influence has been extremely, you know, important in your development as a poet and as a human being?
Oh, I think fundamentally, it has been, like you're sort of a reflection of the family you're born into at times. It's not all times it is. And for me, I think it's just being sort of having the privilege in a way to have all of these incredible books that to be able to read or to listen to to the music I sort of grew up with. I think these have sort of formed me as an individual. And I think from there, I think different shards of those sort of in different excerpts of my writing as well. I think nostalgia is something that I really find myself inclined to write about. And I think these sort of formative years in that way have sort of more these different sources have sort of been molded, has molded me into the poet that I am today.
Mhm. Indeed. Yeah, indeed, indeed. And I think that really shows. So, Shehzar, just for my knowledge and for our viewers and listeners who are curious to know, how old were you when you did start writing poetry? Was it something that started very early on in life, or is this something that you developed sometime later in life?
That's an interesting thing. It's a very interesting question, and I've answered this like a few times in the sense of, for me, poetry as a like when I was a child growing up, sort of disability which sort of inhibited my voice. I mean, like I didn't learn to speak before I was, a certain, like a much later on, and sort of, I was looking for ways of finding my voice and finding my expression. And I think my mother, she used to read to me. Poems at night before I went off to sleep. And like the Sheldon Book of Verses, I remember very intrinsically. So she used to read poems from there, and I think that sort of on this journey of finding expression through poetry. And so I constantly sort of kept that up over the years as a way of finding my own voice, in this world. And I think as that sort of grew and as that sort of grew, I, like anybody else, sort of started just writing, childish poems here and there. And then I do my high school in South India, it was. And over there, I had a fantastic English teacher who sort of introduced me to a lot of poems and poetry that I did not grow. And I think that was a major factor. And I constantly surrounded myself with friends who are sort of, into finding poems and into finding, the latest poems or finding think poetry group over there. I think it's being sort of within these trenches, poetic trenches in a way, that sort of led me. And then through the years, as you sort of grow and you develop your own craft, which is something that I'm very honed in on. Like poetry is, in essence, to me, is a very fundamental core human expression. Like any art form is. And but what makes a poem great is how one is able to sort of craft it. It takes years to sort of hone your own ability to craft a poem. You have so sort of like if you're the conduit for the poem, then you sort of take inspiration and you pen those words down on paper. And the craft of it sort of comes from your ability to edit a piece of work, to look at to see the missing, to fit in the missing pieces as a sort of a jigsaw as well, and to sort of find how best to articulate that expression, which is that innate sort of impulsive spark.
Mhm. Indeed, indeed. And I think that's a very interesting way of putting it, Shehzar. So it's very interesting that you mentioned that you took to speaking a little later on in life than most other kids, and that writing poetry for you was an outlet for you to, be expressive. But having said that, Shehzar, would you say that writing poetry or writing in general comes really easy to you, or would you say that it's something that you do find daunting, for example? So, how would you look at it?
I would say that I don't think anything in life is really easy as such. I think, like I said, going back to the craft of the poem, to sort of I think that takes patience to sort of develop. And like when you say that it gave, like, poetry gave me a voice, it did, because I was able to write down in that form, like I was able to express myself, but then to sort of mold it in a way. Um, I'm just Let me just have a quick think on that, because no, poetry I would not say is something that comes easy. Would is something that is not something that comes easy to me. Like, words can be easy to come by. Words are easy to come by, but to, again, hone that craft over the years is takes a lot of patience and a lot of diligence and a lot of hard work to be able, me like anybody else, is able to do that. It's not something that is just applicable to poets. Anybody can sort of hone work, if they work hard enough on their own poetry, can sort of make it their own in a way. So I wouldn't say it comes easy to me, and I wouldn't say that, I'd encourage anybody to sort of, just give it a try.
Mhm.
And
Yeah. Yeah, well, absolutely. So I think the gist of what you're saying here is that practice actually makes perfect, and that the more time you spend honing your craft, you're obviously going to get better at it, correct?
like, if a person picks up a guitar, they're not automatically a musician. It
Mm.
takes years to develop the practice to be able to um to understand those chords out and out, and then from there to be able to produce own original works. Or any painter who paints up a brush, anybody can pick up a paint brush and do strokes,
Mhm.
which is a part of the expression, which is a wonderful. But at the same time, it takes years of honing a craft to become, to acknowledge oneself as a painter.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. So, Shehzad, that actually leads up to my next question, which is, um, where does a poet find his or her inspiration, and how important is the experiencing pain in order to be able to produce something like like a poem or poetry in general? I think in the book itself as well, if I'm not mistaken, it was your grandfather who alluded to the fact that a poet needs to feel some amount of pain in order to be able to produce his or her best work. Would you agree with that?
I would, but pain comes in many different forms. Pain comes from, is a sort of a manifestation in many ways. I would say, just, it's two parts of a coin as well. One can be as one can, sort of look in the world in a sort of a beautiful, way as well, a unique way, and find forms of artistically deriving from that, as well as, you have pain and you have separation, in many of its in its many sort of ways, and variations. So yes, I think, and then you have inner struggles, which, a lot of people have to go through to overcome. You have external struggles in life which are difficult to sort of meet at that moment in time. So I think all of these, I think life itself is so varied and so nuanced in its ways that I think, a great poem can come from anywhere. It doesn't really just be pain, but I think it's the pain that sort of puts you in the trenches and allows you to appreciate the silences. A lot of chaos can allow you to appreciate the silences, and itself. And I think from there, you sort of grow within, you sort of grow poems from within yourself. Poems sort of gestate within the self, and then I think that's what allows it to sort of mold into uh, coming out and being expressed.
Wow, that's a fabulous way of putting it. I think that it's really interesting that you use the word gestate, because would you say that poetry is something, or maybe writing a song, which is very close to writing lyrics and poetry, etc. I think there was somebody else who mentioned once that they never write songs or poetry. It's sort of something that's revealed to them from another plane of existence altogether, like a divine realm. And we're sort of like the recipients of those words and the content. So is that something that you also feel is true, that we're sort of kind of recipients of these these lyrics and these words and we're sort of kind of like vessels of these expressions? So what would be your take on that?
I would agree with that. Um, in large part, in many ways, because I do believe, like I said earlier, that we are conduits.
Mhm.
And I think that the artistic form sort of it sort of comes from like this is my personal view as a poet,
Yeah.
that it does stem from somewhere. Now, how one would attribute or what one would attribute that to is one's own sort of thing. But in my way, I would say I would sort of articulate it in a very similar way that we are like we have these feelings, we have these expressions which are sort of there, and
Mhm.
we are like pens, sort of conduit, like we are the pens, and then the poem itself is like the ink,
Mhm.
and then it sort of comes into this world, and again, it's a mixture of that, and it's a mixture of the craft as well. I think these are two very vital components, with very vital components to making a good poem.
Mhm.
um, I think, yeah, I would agree with that to a large
Mhm.
extent. I see where that's coming from, and I would agree with that to a large
Mhm.
extent, I'd say.
For sure, for sure. Okay, so Shehzar, we're going to move to talking about the book, but I have one last question relating to you personally. Obviously, it's mentioned in the book that you are a French citizen. So would you say
French
that,
Bangladeshi.
yeah, for sure. And so, just out of curiosity, is the English language your preferred language of expression, or have you also tried dabbling in French as well as Bengali? So, just out of curiosity.
Um, like just going back to the earlier mode, like just going back to the earlier time, I would say that uh, you know, the sort of the difficulty I had growing up was, with had I think in terms of my own development at that age, I would say that like I needed to find a way to sort of focus with, and I ended up choosing English to be my primary, language. I do dabble in and out of different languages within my works that I've been working with, the more sort of experimental style that I've sort of have since I moved to Glasgow. I do dabble in, with using expressions in English, in Bengali and French, and using it, within the English poems. And I think this is something which allows a lot of variations and a lot of uh, it opens up a whole new world altogether. But primarily, I would say English.
Mhm. Absolutely. Okay, so now on to the book itself, Shezar. So, uh, the the book is entitled Drift. So, the first question I have for you with regards to the book itself is, what does the title signify, and why have you chosen this as the title for this book containing 14 poems?
I would say that the chart is very much a reflection of my own understanding of things as well. I mean, I think originally the title was Drifting, but then we sort of moved it down to just drift. It's a lot stronger that way. And, like it's a reflection of my own movements as well. I think, like within the whole body of work, there's a lot of movement, allowing sort of feeling the spaces out with in a sort of a very water-like movement. The poem itself, Drift, which is the title poem, was written for Alan Kurdi, the Syrian refugee who was washed up on shore. And as sort of like the poem sort of alludes to the image of sort of drifting up onto the tides. But in a way, for me, a lot of the images within the collection itself is there is a lot of drift of energy, there is a lot of drift of movements, of mindsets. And I think because of that, because it played such a sort of a pivotal part, I have my own sort of reflection of the external world with me moving around. I think sort of came up to that title as an apt reflection for the collection.
Absolutely. And well, that's really powerful, Shehzar, because I did not know that that poor Syrian boy who washed up on shore was the inspiration behind the title, and it obviously has that really sad undertone to it, which just talking to you now, I can understand that particular dimension of it. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that's really something that our viewers and listeners will be very interested to have heard. Now, Shehzar, the book has a list of 14 poems. So just out of curiosity, once again, are these poems that have been written over a short time span, or is it something that you've selected from different aspects or different timelines, which encompass your whole life? So, what would be your answer to that?
I think originally this collection was set to be a lot bigger. It was set to be a lot larger, containing a lot more poems. I think it's for me, since it's my first, since it was the first sort of book that I put out. I think sort of you want to encapsulate, you sort of want to put everything that you've ever written
Yeah.
into one giant collection, to just let it out there. But then I had the giant privilege of working with the great Indian poet Sudeep Sen, and learning from him. I think one learns a lot from being around such an esteemed writer. And I think one of the main things I learned was that to put in the strongest works necessarily. And I think that this entire collection, as it stands now, is more of a narrative. It has a more sort of a cohesive narrative than small bits and bobs of little poems, scattered across that you can put together. I think a poetry collection is a lot more. I think within the framework and the narrative of a poetry collection itself, it's more important to have something that sort of fits within the mold. You do have many collections which are great and which are sort of many poems from here and there. But I think for this particular one, me being my first one, I think it was a lot more important to sort of hone down on the silences, you know, to sort of and sort of bring forth the pieces which I felt at that moment of time were most had the most to say within its small. It's a relatively small book. It's a relatively small book, but but I feel that I think because of that, I think because of the sort of the brevity of it, it allowed the I think it sort of allows a space for the readers to sort of um, you know, to take the words that much more seriously, I think.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that using the word brevity and it really captures the spirit of the some of the poems because um, uh, the brevity of words, for example, in a couple of the poems, which was quite interesting. Was that what was the thinking behind that? Where the parsimonious use of words, you could say. So, with regards to some of the poems, just out of curiosity, the creative process that went into having something like those particular poems. Can you tell us a bit more about that with regards to the brevity of words for some of the poems? Yeah.
Uh, like I feel like a large section, like what I had alluded to earlier as well, that if poetry comes from a different source, I think from a different source, and you're sort of conduiting those words, then the spaces in those words are as important. You know, the spaces that you use within those words allow for silences as well. I think because of that, I think the certain not only spaces, but I would say um, I think the juxtaposition between the sort of the larger narrative pieces that are there and the smaller pieces which sort of flow out more naturally are sort of reflective of very different moments of time and different sort of drives. So in a way, certain poems are reflective of those more solemn times, those more solemn introspections. And sometimes, you just have this urge to, just be as expressive as possible. So I think it's sort of like in that juxtaposition between, having more, having poems with a lot of, a lot of narrative and a lot of movement, and having poems which are sort of just allowed their own space to in the silence and between those, and in the spaces of those words, allow a drift in consciousness as well. I think, and because of that, I think it's sort of, for me, one of the intentionality was it's a reflection of life as well, where it is a sort of a composition of these staggering moments between uh, energy, like seismic energy and stillness.
Understood. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of putting it. So, in other words, less is more, and you're able to use silence as well in order to send a message. So that's really, really interesting, and I think that it's very nicely explained. Now, Shehzar, do you have a favorite out of the 14 poems that made it into the book? Out of the 14 poems that have been published, do you happen to have a favorite?
It's difficult to have a favorite. All they're all very reflective of different moments of times and different periods in my life. As I said, I think I published this book when I was much later on than what a young starting poet would be when starting it out. So it was more of a collection in that sense because and then I sort of then my editor and I we whittled away the poems, a lot of poems. So I think it's difficult because these 14 poems each represent different moments. I think in terms of the craft and the sort of the building, one poem, I think I think Drift and the largest poem, Colorblind. These two, I would say, are the ones that I'm most attached to because I've read them out, in many different poetry circles, and I've read, in different countries. I've read them out in different literary festivals here and there. So those have, I think, played a large, have sort of stayed with me the most. But like every single poem is a reflection of a different moment, and I think we're having it being so small. I think having just 14 poems allows it to be a lot more intimate. Allows the collection to be a lot more intimate, more on a personal level, and as a collective as well.
Interesting. Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. One of the things that I noticed, Shehzar, was that uh, you seem to have alluded a lot to Greek mythology, or at least you've name dropped a lot of Greek gods and goddesses. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? Why Greek mythology in particular? Is this something that you have a personal interest in, or is it just something that you felt was the best way of expressing, best way of giving life to your expressions? So yeah, please tell us about that.
I would I would say it's a cornerstone of both because as myself, I have many poems with different allusions to different mythical constructs in a way, archetypal constructs. If you're sort of like writing poems which are sort of reflective in a way of different human conditions, then you sort of automatically are naturally inclined to modes of pre-existing expressions which have sort of built itself up over time. Throughout human history, certain words, certain meanings have sort of composited in its own way different meanings. And I think a large part of that is it was a very different period of my life. I think the poetry that I write now is very different to what I had written back then, which is great. Which is it's sort of like you're developing and you're working with whatever comes to you at that moment of time. But I think having these sort of cornerstone ideas and constructs sort of pre-built already, allows you to sort of have not shortcuts. Well, in a way, it is not exactly a shortcut, but it is um, it's a direct link to, as you had said, ideas that have pre-existed you, or anybody that you've been you surround yourself with. And I think it allows you to automatically connect, to an audience, to a larger audience, which might not necessarily have, knowledge of more, let's say, niche uh, ideas. But, in a way, thinking about that now, as I've developed as a writer, I think that's a very sort of which is, I feel has sort of evolved within me as well, to be a bit more niche and nuances with my work, as I see it now. So it's a reflection. It's a reflection. It's ideally a reflection to walk with, and you're comfortable. The idea of the comfort as well as a writer, and then you sort of move. And once you've understood, once you've placed your foot a little bit and understood, sort of found your bearings a little bit, then you sort of can way onwards.
Interesting. Well, I have to confess that my poetic interests were more towards Sufi philosophy as well as the Semitic religion. So I was quite happy when I found one word which you used in one of the poems, kosher, and so that was something that I really enjoyed. But I wasn't as familiar with Greek mythology as I was with the Egyptian counterparts, etc. So I had a blast, just going through all the names that were dropped and trying to get a feel for their backstory. So yeah, I think that's absolutely wonderful. Now, Shehzar, I'm just gonna read
And I
some.
think that's a great part. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, you were sorry. Go
I,
ahead. Yeah.
yeah, I was just saying that that's a great part of reading a new like reading something that you might not normally be, sort of the exploration of those fundamental ideas or those fundamental new things that sort
Yeah.
of just come from within a new collection. Like I read so many different collections, at the moment, and I think with you discover. I think it's the discovery of things that sort of allows you to to grow as a writer as well. So I think, yeah, I'm very happy to actually hear that you sort of explored and dived into the different, into the pot of different, allusions that were there throughout.
For sure, for sure. And that I think that it really made the curiosity that drove me to actually find out more about their backstory, the different deities, uh, just made the reading experience that much more enjoyable. Now, I did have one question about the second poem, Shehzar, Compost Mantis. Um, it is prose for the most part, but there is one small section which has rhyming poetry in it, which I found quite interesting. Now, what was the thinking behind that? Is this something that you've done deliberately, or was it just the break that you made from prose and then suddenly having a section that goes into rhyming poetry and then going back into prose? So, what was the thinking behind that, if you would like to share?
Again, I think you're sort of referring to a carpet of snowy shards wherein lies the muted bards. That's sort of the section behind that of compost mentis. The meaning itself is sort of derived from of sound mind, somebody who's sound mind. And I think the sort of the juxtaposition to that, I think, is was a large part of the narrative. This poem itself has a very it's sort of funnily enough, we talk about all of these mythical allusions and stuff like that. But this sort of this the composite of this poem was sort of based off of a very pop culture, very sort of a new age pop culture character from a TV show. That I happened to television show that I loved. And like this one character was very sort of was moving, was shifting in and out of these sort of varied consciousness at this moment of time. And as I was sort of composing as I was sort of composing this poem, this whole sort of this whole sort of inter intermovements, interweaving of arts in a way played a large part of it, because when we imagine things, it's like imagining yourself as verse. Like suppose we look at the world as fiction, as a narrative, as a fiction, and then sort of existing within moments as poetry. It's sort of like looking at life, looking through life as poetry, as poems, as every single movement, everything that magical that happens are poems, that are either already pre-existing, or you yourself are writing at that, or you yourself are scribing at that moment to the universe. So within that, you have different forms, you have different forms of artistic expression. And I think that allowing yourself the space, as I said, like this was written as a theatrical piece, as a sort of a monologue in a way. So you imagine, so it's moving, it's sort of drifting between is sort of drifting between this, over dramatic theatrical, you know, characterization, larger than life characterization. And it's into, and within those narratives as well, you have a poem, and then within the poem itself, you have a song, you have a musical moment.
Mhm.
So I think, this sort of diving into different layers of one's own psyche, or one's own mind. It I think it asks. I intended it to ask these questions. Poems are like a large portion of the time you write them to ask questions of the universe, and not necessarily have the answers.
Mhm.
So I think, in a way, I think these sort of movements within it allowed it the space to to breathe,
For sure, for
to come
sure.
to in its own way.
Yeah, absolutely. That I think that's really nicely said. And I'm pretty sure that this is my favorite poem from the book, Compost Mantis, simply because it kind of reminds me a little bit about if you were to have a play, a tragedy, for example, there's always one section which alludes to, comic relief. And so for me, reading this particular poem, this particular section is probably equivalent to the comic relief that we would find while reading a tragedy. So yeah, I definitely am settled on this as my favorite poem. But Sheza, if I were to ask you, your fans and readers will also have their own favorite poem as well. But so, what has been the feedback so far from your readers with regards to what they, on average, find to be their favorite poem from the book?
A large section of it has been the two that I've mentioned already. There's a reason why I keep constant repeating those. Like even in my even nowadays, where like, oh, it's been what, I published this in 2016. I think it's been many years since then. My poetry sort of shifted, but I still keep coming back to those two poems. And I think a large part of it has been, because of that. But I read different poems of it, of the collection. I think each has its own moment. Each has its own moment. So I think by and large, those two have sort of garnered the most sort of intense reactions. But I think like even like you just said right now, that Compost Mantis is your favorite poem. So it's always lovely to hear, that a poem outside of the of the traditional ones can sort of have its own place, with somebody else. I had no idea. So I
Mhm.
think you never know what a person reading a collection or reading your collection will feel about it, or which one they might automatically be drawn to. Another friend of mine felt very drawn to the poem Belief. Another one felt very in tune with the poem through a movement or separation at that time. So I think overall it's very difficult to determine
Mhm.
what the reaction would be, but I think by and large the safe bets that I go with are Colorblind and Drift.
Colorblind and Drift. Okay, fabulous, fabulous. Okay, so Shezar, we're actually coming to the last quarter of our hour here. So there are a couple of staple questions that we like to ask all of our guests. And so I'm going to have to, because we are, after all, a book-related podcast, I need to ask you, what is the genre of books that you personally like to read? Would you say that you're
I think
more
you know
into
the answer to that.
fiction or non-fiction? Come again? Sorry.
I think you'd already have an answer to that question. It's poetry. Like, I'm pretty much obsessed in my life with poetry, you know.
Mhm.
I am, you know, I'm a poetry reviews editor at Guttural magazine in here in Scotland, which is one of the biggest literary magazines. Uh, you know, I have to go through so many different poems and collections that sort of come out all across the country. So, you know, like I'm constantly sort of just enveloped within the new uh, exciting works that are sort of there and present within the sort of the literary landscape, not just within Scotland, but as well.
Absolutely. Well, that's really fabulous to hear, Shehzar. So it's poetry and reading poems and sifting through them and trying to find
It's my
hidden
life.
gems. Okay, so I'm really glad to hear that. Now, Shehzar, obviously you are a vociferous reader. So I need to ask that if you could recommend a book that you feel that, let's say, every young person should read at least once in their lifetime. Uh, doesn't have to be a book on poetry, but anything in general, any genre, anything at all. What would be that one book that you feel that everybody should read at least once in their lifetime?
It's a difficult. I don't have an answer to that at the moment. Like I said, you know, like I honestly, I could give you, you know, a very standard answer. You know, like I could say like you know, say Herman Hesse, which is something that I keep coming back to because I think my parents both loved that book, and I sort of studied that book in school and sort of, you know, very sort of had a philosophical epiphany because of it. But you know, I could name that, or uh, there are just too many to name. I think no, I'm gonna skip out on this one because
Okay.
you know I can say for a young person to read out obviously in the poetry books, like if they're extremely young, then like myself, read the Sheldon Book of Verses. You know, that sort of got me to, you know, to my own path and journey into poetry. Um, but I think I'm gonna skip out on that one for now.
Not, yeah, no worries. So I usually tell my guests that, take your time in answering this particular question, because a lot of them have said that agree that this is pretty much a difficult question, but no worries. So we'll take your answer on that. Now, Shehzar, do you have a favorite living poet and a favorite dead poet? If I were to ask you this question, so one of each. So what would be your answer to that question?
Okay, I'll give a cop out. So at the moment, I am like I love the poetry of Adonis. You know, the thing. You know, I've just been rereading some of his older collections. You know, I think you know we're still, you know, he had come to the Dhaka Lit Fest as well. It was amazing to hear him, and then I heard him again in London. And just, you know, something mesmeric about the way he about the poems that he writes. And then, funnily enough, I would say amongst the dead poets at the moment, again, these are, you know, like I think 5 minutes from now, if you ask me the question, it'll be a different answer. But I think at the moment, I'm reading a lot of T.S. Eliot again. I mean, I think he's been a large influence in my work. I love that whole sort of modernist movement in general. So I think, you know, and he plays a large influence in a lot of my writings, even now. So those are the two answers I would give.
Fabulous,
But again,
fabulous.
ask me in 10 minutes and the answers will be completely different.
That's a wonderful way of putting it. So yeah, it's I suppose a lot of it depends on our mood at the time. So yeah, poetry like music, the kind of poetry that we read and the kind of music that we listen to, so I think it's quite similar. It all depends on how we're feeling at the moment. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Now, Shezar, what kind of advice would you give to any young person who was looking to get into poetry or writing and publishing in general and kind of wants to make a career out of it? Is there any kind of advice that you would give as a seasoned veteran in this field for any young people coming along?
I wouldn't call myself a veteran just yet. I hope not. I'm quite young but I would say read and be caught up on contemporary work, because I think a large portion, this is very applicable to Bangladesh and within the subcontinent, in general, the poetry that we sort of grow up with are these old, are sort of reflective, are these old poets who are sort of reflective of a certain moment in time. We read your Wordsworth and this, they might be great poets, but they're not reflective of reflecting the now, you know. I think it's very, very important to read contemporary literary journals and small literary journals. I mean, when I was growing up in Bangladesh, we didn't have access to these amazing, amazing small literary journals that exist. That have, sort of that have sort of come about and sort of, been placeholders or been sort of movement makers in a way. So I think it's very important to read. I think with the world that we exist in now, you can have, you just look up, these random magazines, literary magazines from all over the world. You see what's happening in the literary landscape, move all the time. But you have to know these movements as they're happening, because if you don't, then you're just reflecting archaic thoughts and archaic things. There is a danger to that, in the sense that poetry becomes stagnant because of that. With the lack of passion, with the lack of innovation, with the lack of drive at times in certain places. That, if all you've grown up with is learning how to express words in, expressing poems in like AABA, or, your traditional formats, then you lose so much. I mean, you gain a lot. You gain a lot of, because, you have your fundamentals at place. But at the same time, you lose out on so much, because you're not aware of all the different experimental forms and the way that poetry can move, not just within words, but words and images. You have this space, you have an amazing movement in, like not just Glasgow, but everywhere else. You have digital poetics, which is sort of, you move in between these spaces of writing, on the page, and then writing on poetry. You have different scenes, and I think losing out on, it becomes dangerous when it becomes like a pool in a way, when you sort of don't have access, or when you don't sort of encourage young writers to look, to put their feet rather than into the pool that already exists, that is a pool of old uh, old colonial poets, let's say, and instead put your feet into the ocean and then feel what that's like, you know
Mhm.
feel the ocean, because it is that deep. The world, every part of the world has its own different literary movements, and I think the more um, you know you put yourself into those spaces, I think the more you sort of allow those to encourage you to sort of make your own or create your own. I think every young writer has this sort of drive or initiative to create change, and um, I think it sort of can come from that. So I think we should be teaching a lot more contemporary, great, great contemporary poets, and leaving those. I mean, not leaving those behind, but putting them a bit more on the shelf, let's say, and
Mhm.
actively and being active about teaching contemporary poets what's happening in the world, what is making it, the practical aspects of it, the practical angles of what's making the shelf. And like you can there are literary magazines, like I run the like I founded the Luxembourg Review when I moved to
Mhm.
Luxembourg in 2014, and I've had access to, as a result of that, I've had access to so many different writers from across the world. And I constantly see, different forms and different innovations. Same with being the poetry reviews editor at Guttural at the moment. And, I've edited other journals. I've, committees for prizes. I think a combination of all of those, allows you to grow and evolve as a writer. I think, and I think nowadays in the digital space and the digital accessibility that exists, I think we should be taking a lot more use of that, especially in the subcontinent. I think otherwise we're just not going to grow,
Mm.
and create a new generation of writers to spread out across the world.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a very interesting way of putting it, Shehzar. So, just a related question, Shehzar. With regards to Bangladesh in particular, and okay, so let me just backtrack a bit. In India, for example, where there's so much diversity in terms of ethnicity as well as languages. There is also a tradition of Indian writers writing in English. But with regards to Bangladesh, would you say that do we have that culture of English language writing by Bangladeshis, or is it more overshadowed by the overall, Bengali language, which is kind of all-encompassing, and so the English writers in Bangladesh tend to get fallen by the wayside or forgotten altogether? What would be your opinion on that?
I haven't lived in Bangladesh for a long time, I think. So, like currently, what's happening, as of this moment, I can't give you an exact, but I have seen over the years these sort of, this development of new writing in English. I think I would count from that, category as well. Writers who write in English. I think a lot more is sort of happening within the spoken word scene. I think that's something that's sort of very empowered. That's a sort of a very empowering movement that finding itself in different art, different scenes across Dhaka and everything. I think there is definitely right now. I think Great Fest sort of open up Dhaka to the world. I think we've seen monumental shifts of writers in English coming out and sort of taking different, taking moving out into different parts of the world. Diaspora writing in a way. And I think yes, a large part of it is, I think, overshadowed. But I wouldn't say overshadowed because we have to preserve our own language and we have to preserve as well. Obviously it has its own sort of own bearing and place. But I think we should be making more movements with translations. I think like translating a lot that exist into Bengali to have access to a different market, and then vice versa. I think a lot more of the Bengali poets that are sort of that sort of might have that accessibility into the English markets, but are no, I think there has to be movements on both ends, active movements on both ends to sort of encourage, discourage, and I think within that, we will start finding more hidden gems, and start finding more things that are relatable within, these different movements. And uh, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I'd say, yeah, just to work with each other rather than, I think we should work with each other. English poets should actively opportunities for unappreciated Bengali poets, Bengali writing poets, and find them spaces within their world. And I think the reverse should be, encouraged.
For sure, for sure. No, I think that's really beautifully said, Shehzar, that especially the translation process, you have Bengali language writers who should be given access to the English speaking world and vice versa, so that there's a good melange as well as lot more collaborative efforts rather than competition. Yeah, so I think that's really well said. Now, Shehzar, we're right at the edge of finishing up this episode. But before we really let you go, just two questions. Number one, what current or future writing projects do you have in the pipeline? And number two, if your fans and readers wanted to get in touch with you, what would be the best way to do so?
Um, I would. I have an like the thing is, currently completing my PhD. I'm creating this. It's a DFA. It's a doctorate in fine arts. So I'm creating a collection of poems on something on a sort of this poetics that I'm creating called Shisha poetics. You know, and it's about the drift of smoke in a way in various angles. So I'm putting together a collection of poems. And I have so many different projects coming up. I have a new pamphlet coming out from Broken Sleep Books. They're a publishing house here in the UK. It's a pamphlet of 8 poems, which is a small, contextual aside within the larger narrative of the overarching collection. I have an exhibition coming up at this legendary, um, uh, this legendary gallery called the Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh. I think that's sort of like taking my Shisha poetics out into the art space, into the art world. I think, yeah, and those are the two major ones that I have for now. The three major ones: the DFA, the pamphlet, and the exhibition. But yeah, these things are constantly coming around because I'm always trying to think of new ideas to sort of, do. I mean, just to be in this constant movement, I think it's important to not stagnate as a poet, as an artist in any capacity. And yeah, I'm very open. Like you can follow me on Twitter, and on Twitter it's at Shehzar, and then I'm on Instagram, Shehzar Doja. Yeah, so those are the two primary ones that I use, and
Mhm.
yeah. And
Wonderful.
I'm very
Okay.
open. So just if you have a question, but I can't promise I can answer it all the time because there's a lot of work and life comes in the way. But I'll
Right.
you try my best.
Okay, fabulous. Okay, so Instagram and Twitter. So those are your preferred mediums of communication with your fans. Excellent. So
Yeah,
we'll
and
definitely
the
have
name
that up.
is like it is on the Zoom here. I think it's like it's on the Zoom here. So
Okay, all right. Okay, so we'll definitely have those up in the description so that everybody will be able to get in touch with you. Now, Shehzar, before we really let you go, we have one final request, and that is, would you mind reading a poem from your book for our viewers and listeners before we let you go? Yeah.
from Rift,
Yeah, from Drift.
let's see. So okay, I will read Drift itself.
Mhm.
You know,
Good choice. Yeah.
uh, yeah, I think sort of drifting back
Mm.
to the beginning. Are we merely empty lines, hollow sketches, forgettable fodder, dejected outlines? Forgive us as trespassers, as we transgress our own wake, wave after wave, our corpses folded into eulogies. What broken voices lull us to sleep? What forgiveness as we embrace separate shores? One more silenced voice drifts up between sand and the ocean.
Mm.
That was drift.
Wow. Fabulous. Thank you so much, Shehzar. I think that was an immaculate reading, and I'm just really thrilled to have had you on the show to talk about the book. So, once again, for our viewers and listeners, the book is Drift by Shehzar Doja. Shehzar, thank you so much for your time. You obviously have a very busy schedule pursuing your PhD, so it really means a lot that you were able to make the time to talk to us on Book Cafe podcast. I wish you all the best with all of your future endeavors, and I really hope to have you back on the show for a future episode to talk about your future writing projects. So thank you.
That would be absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.